They say if you listen closely to an old kettle, you can hear it breathe. But this one? It doesn't just breathe. It speaks. And the last thing it whispers is your name. This is the story of the crying kettle. And once you hear it, you'll never boil water the same way again. Welcome back to MissCreepyFace, where we explore the darkest corners of the paranormal world. Before we begin, I want to remind you, tonight's story is entirely fictional. It's created for your entertainment to give you chills and maybe make you think twice about what's lurking in your own kitchen. But here's the thing about good creepy stories. The best ones feel real. So settle in. Dim the lights if you dare. And let me tell you about a kettle that changed the way an entire village understood death. The year was 1863. The place, Ashford Hollow, a small mining village in northern England. The winters were brutal. The coal mines were unforgiving. And death was never far away. In the heart of this village stood a modest home belonging to a woman named Margaret Thorne. Margaret was a widow at 32. Her husband, William, had died in a mine collapse 3 years earlier. But Margaret didn't grieve like the others. She didn't cry. She didn't speak of him. Instead, she talked to her kettle. Every evening, Margaret would sit by her hearth, place her copper kettle over the flames and wait. The villagers thought it was madness, the lonely ritual of a broken woman. But Margaret knew something they didn't. The kettle answered back. You see, the kettle wasn't just any kettle. It had belonged to her grandmother, a woman the village whispered about in hushed tones. They called her the Mourning Woman, because she could sense death before it arrived. She knew who would die, before they knew themselves. And she passed that gift, or curse, into the one object she treasured most. The first time Margaret heard the kettle speak, she was alone. It was a Tuesday. The fire was low. The kettle began to whistle, normal at first. But then, the whistle changed. It became a voice. A woman's voice. And it said a name. Thomas Brennan. Thomas Brennan was a miner. Strong. Healthy. Only 28 years old. Margaret ran to warn him. But he laughed. "You've gone mad, widow," he said. 7 days later, Thomas Brennan was dead, crushed in the same mine that took her husband. After Thomas, Margaret tried to ignore the kettle. She covered it with cloth. She moved it to the cellar. But every night at exactly 11:47 p.m., she could hear it, whistling, whispering, crying. The second name came 2 weeks later. Eleanor Price. Eleanor was the baker's daughter, 19 years old, about to be married. This time, Margaret begged her to stay inside. Eleanor listened, for 6 days. On the 7th day, she stepped outside to fetch water from the well. She slipped. She fell. The well was 40 feet deep. They never recovered her body. Over the next 3 years, the kettle spoke 17 names. 17 names. 17 deaths. All exactly 7 days after the kettle called them. The village called it the Crying Kettle, because the whistle sounded like sobbing, like mourning, like it was grieving for them, before they were gone. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Margaret began to write down the names. She kept a journal, leather-bound, hidden beneath her floorboards. Inside, she documented everything. The name, the date, the manner of death, and one more thing. The kettle's mood. You see, Margaret noticed patterns. When the kettle whistled softly, the death would be peaceful. When it screamed, it would be violent. And when the whistle turned to actual crying, sobbing like a grieving mother, the victim would die alone, undiscovered for days. Now, before we continue with what happened next, and trust me, it gets even darker, I want to take a quick moment. If you're enjoying this story so far, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. I know, everyone says that. But here's the thing. Only about 30% of the people watching this will actually subscribe. That means most of you are enjoying MissCreepyFace content, without being part of the family. And I don't want you to miss what's coming next week, because the story I have planned, it's even more terrifying than this one. So go ahead, tap subscribe. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And drop a comment right now telling me, Have you ever heard a strange sound in your kitchen that you couldn't explain? I want to know. All right. Now, where were we? Ah yes, the investigation. Because word of the crying kettle eventually reached someone who wanted to understand. Someone who should have stayed far, far away. Word of the crying kettle eventually reached London. In 1866, a man named Dr. Aldous Crane arrived in Ashford Hollow. He was a professor of folklore at Oxford, but his true passion was the paranormal. He'd spent decades studying objects that seemed to hold consciousness, mirrors that showed impossible reflections, clocks that stopped at the moment of death, and now, a kettle that prophesied the end. Dr. Crane spent 3 months with Margaret. He recorded every whistle. He measured the temperature of the water at the moment of whispering. He even brought in a linguist to analyze the accent of the kettle's voice. What he discovered changed him. The voice is not random. It is not Margaret projecting her grief. The kettle speaks with the voice of someone who died in great sorrow, a woman who lost everyone she loved. The copper has absorbed her anguish, her desperation, her need to warn others. But something went wrong. The warnings became prophecies. The kettle doesn't just sense death, it schedules it. On his final night in Ashford Hollow, Dr. Crane heard the kettle speak. He was alone. Margaret had gone to fetch firewood. The whistle began high-pitched, then falling into that unmistakable sob. And then, a name. Aldous Crane. Dr. Crane left the village the next morning. He told no one what he'd heard. He returned to London. He locked himself in his study. And 7 days later, he was found dead at his desk. His heart had simply stopped. No medical explanation. No signs of struggle. Just a look of absolute terror frozen on his face. And on his desk, a half-finished letter that read, "The kettle doesn't predict death. It causes it. Do not listen. Do not." The letter was never completed. Margaret Thorne died in 1871. She was 40 years old. The cause? Unknown. But according to village records, on the night of her death, the kettle screamed for 3 hours straight. And the name it whispered? Her own. After Margaret's death, the kettle passed through dozens of hands. An antique dealer in Manchester, a collector in Edinburgh, a museum curator in York. Each owner reported the same thing. Unexplained whistling, whispered names, and deaths, always 7 days later. In 1923, the kettle was purchased by an American businessman visiting London. He brought it back to Boston. Within 2 months, 3 members of his household staff were dead. The kettle was donated to a university archive. In 1967, it was moved to a private collection in New Orleans. And then, it vanished. For over 50 years, no one knew where the crying kettle was. Until 2019. A woman in Portland, Oregon, posted on an antique forum. She'd found an old copper kettle at an estate sale. Beautiful craftsmanship. Victorian-era. She thought it would look perfect in her kitchen. But there was something strange about it. Every night around midnight, it would whistle. Even when it wasn't on the stove. Even when there was no water inside. She posted photos. Antique experts confirmed it matched every description of the crying kettle. People begged her to get rid of it. She laughed it off. "It's just an old kettle," she wrote. 3 weeks later, her account went silent. Her final post? A single sentence. It said, "My name last night." She was found 7 days later. Alone in her apartment. No cause of death determined. And the kettle? Gone. Vanished from her kitchen without a trace. So what makes the crying kettle so terrifying? Some paranormal researchers believe it's a case of psychometric imprinting. The theory that strong emotions can embed themselves into objects. The original owner, Margaret's grandmother, may have poured so much grief into that kettle that it became a vessel for her sorrow. But others believe something darker. They say the kettle isn't just absorbing energy, it's feeding on it. Every death makes it stronger. Every name gives it power. And it's been collecting names for over 160 years. Perhaps the most chilling theory comes from Dr. Helena Marsh, a modern paranormal investigator who studied the kettle in 2018. She believes the kettle doesn't just predict death, It creates a contract. When you hear your name, you've been chosen. And no amount of hiding, running, or praying can break that bond. The kettle has decided. And the kettle always collects. She was found 7 days later, alone in her apartment. No cause of death determined. And the kettle? Gone. Vanished from her kitchen without a trace. So what makes the crying kettle so terrifying? Some paranormal researchers believe it's a case of psychometric imprinting. The theory that strong emotions can embed themselves into objects. The original owner, Margaret's grandmother, may have poured so much grief into that kettle that it became a vessel for her sorrow. But others believe something darker. They say the kettle isn't just absorbing energy, it's feeding on it. Every death makes it stronger. Every name gives it power. And it's been collecting names for over 160 years. Perhaps the most chilling theory comes from Dr. Helena Marsh, a modern paranormal investigator who studied the kettle in 2018. She believes the kettle doesn't just predict death, it creates a contract. When you hear your name, you've been chosen. And no amount of hiding or running can break that bond. The kettle has decided. And the kettle always collects. Now I have a question for you. If you heard a whisper in your kitchen tonight, and it called your name, what would you do? Would you run? Would you try to destroy it? Or would you listen, hoping to understand? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. Also, I'm curious, have you ever had a strange experience with an ordinary household object? Something that moved on its own? Made sounds it shouldn't? Felt alive? Tell me about it. Because here at MissCreepyFace, we know the truth. The scariest things aren't in haunted houses. They're in your kitchen, your bathroom, your bedroom, waiting. If you made it this far, thank you. Seriously, you're the reason I tell these stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button right now. Join the MissCreepyFace family.